Be a part of the force that powers truth in journalism. Your support helps to combat false media. Cash App NNV News.
Let's have a discussion. People have questions. They would like answers. Let's talk about the issues. Confront the things that may be difficult to address. The Black narrative. Greetings. My name is Steve Muhammad, and this is the Black narrative on the National Network View. And today we're going to be talking about the subject, the Negro experiment. As you all know, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan on July the 4th delivered a powerful message called the Criterion, in which he warned us, not to take the vaccine. And one of the reasons, of course, behind that, and one of the reasons why Black people are so hesitant, rightfully so, of getting the vaccine is because there's a long history. And I'll say that really that history began when our feet first touched the soils of North America, that this history of experimenting on Black people began, and really with our first contact with the Europeans. So today we have talking with us Professor Taylor Curtis, MA, and she is the African American Studies Program Director and Assistant Professor of Psychology in the Psychology Department at Sinclair Community College. And I would like to welcome you on to the show. Sister Taylor, how are you doing today?
I am doing so good to be here. I am dealing with some health issues, so I think this is a great topic to talk about, and I'll share a little bit about that. But aside from that, I am doing well.
Yeah, because you told me you had some a surgery going up, and I didn't want to get into any private issues, but sure, if you could, if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think it falls directly in line with what we're talking about, because a lot of us as Black people, particularly Black men, right, that we're afraid of going to the hospital. We already have that machismo, right, that we don't want to get any type of help for any medical hurt, aches, or pains. But then on top of that, in the back of our mind, we're thinking that if we go into this hospital, we'll be coming out. And today we're hearing a lot of stories about people who are going in for one issue and then end up catching the COVID-19 coronavirus and not coming out. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go ahead and get right on into this important topic.
Yeah, well, okay. So in my experience, which is an experience that I think a lot of women of color share, I had my first fibroid tumor diagnosed when I was about 19 years old. In my experience, medical health was important, but the history of my family wasn't necessarily something that had been passed down, at least not explicitly. I think that was one thing that I can say we didn't do as well of. I knew maybe immediate family, like my mother and my father, what kind of medical history they might have had, but not necessarily things that are generational and things that we see throughout the family. And for me, I thought that having a doctor that would understand me and listen to me and hear me would be so important. But in my experience, I had a Black woman that was my doctor, and I thought, wow, this must be like, okay, everything's going to be great. This is going to be a great situation. But in reality, my doctor did not listen to me. And so she wasn't really hearing me and hearing my complaints about my issues and my pains and things like that. And so even in asking about my fibroid tumor and making sure that we are checking up on it and monitoring the process and the growth and making sure that we're knowing what's happening and how that might impact fertility, I thought that I wasn't being heard and wasn't being listened to. And then when the pandemic hit, I am high risk. I have asthma and I have some other issues, autoimmune issues and things like that. And so I absolutely did not want to go to a hospital just to go to a regular doctor checkup.
Right.
And I could not find an alternative. There was no alternative because my doctor's office was located in a hospital. And
Mm.
because there was no alternative, I decided to stop seeing that doctor. I felt like I wasn't being listened to. They were giving me the runaround and things like that, leaving me in the waiting room for hours and you're in surgery. I mean, all kinds of things were happening. And I
Right.
thought, if I looked different, would my treatment be like this?
Mm. Right.
Even
That's a
though
good
the
point.
doctor looks like me,
Mm-hmm.
if I look different, would my treatment be different?
Right.
And I went to another doctor, and upon first arrival, that doctor was able to determine that I had some more serious issues going on, and got me into an ultrasound and started making arrangements. And within 2 months, I was scheduled for surgery,
Mm.
which will take place at the end of this month. And this particular issue I have is called endometriosis, and it's a common issue that we
Right.
see in women of color. And a lot of times it goes undetected because it can't be scanned for, and
Mm.
because you can't see it physically through a X-ray or an ultrasound. You have to actually have severe symptoms, and typically they find it during surgery. And
Mm.
so I know so many young women of color who've had the symptoms, but because they don't know how to advocate for themselves in the healthcare field, they're talking to doctors who are not doing the extra work and taking the extra step to determine what's
Mm-hmm.
going on. And because of
Right.
that, that could cause infertility. I mean, and it's something that we see, as a chance, because the endometriosis is basically what we have inside of us to prepare a baby that women usually experience dispelling every month. That is growing inside the womb and outside the womb, and there's nowhere for it to dispel if it's outside of the womb. And so it can attach to different parts of the womb and then therefore cause the woman to be infertile. And so I can only imagine how had I continued at the doctor I was at, the rate at which my condition could have gotten worse and how that could impact me. Even
Right.
now, we still have no clarity as to what the extent of my condition is, and there's still no guarantee that fertility is even possible, but there's no guarantee that it isn't. And if we catch it early, we have the opportunity to prevent further issues. And I think, again, what we see commonly is that issue of not being heard. And
Mm.
because we aren't heard and don't know how to advocate for ourselves, a lot of times it leads to further complications or further health issues, or the lack of our health education in a way that will prevent us from having some of these issues that we often think are even due to our culture. Um, Things like diabetes, things like high
Right.
blood pressure, things like heart disease. These things are not because of being Black. We
Right.
think of them as Black diseases, but they come oftentimes because of circumstances and because of things passed on through the generations and because of the way that our society has been systemically impacted by racism. And it is those things that lead to the impact of mortality in the Black community for sure.
Yeah. And so you make up so many good points. I mean, there's so much that you in just that opening, you know, really exposed. Number one, we had on Dr. Akili Muhammad, right? One of the things that he talked about was just because you have a Black doctor, don't think that just like a Black police officer, they were trained under that same system of white supremacy and oppression. And to a large degree, that training has conditioned them really to look at us the same way that white doctors do. And another issue that you brought up, unfortunately, is that we don't have, any alternative doctors, any alternative medicine. And as we know from the teachings, as I know, of course, from the teachings of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, as taught by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, a lot of our problems stem from the fact that the food is poison, the water is poison, and even the air that we breathe is poisoned. So, like for women, you talk about the endometriosis, right? And for men, prostate cancer, and both of these cancers are more than common within the Black community, and it's not by accident. So we definitely want to send out our prayers to you, that everything goes well. Everyone who's watching, please say a prayer for our sister, that everything goes well, because as you can already tell from the very beginning, that this sister is a giant. So what we wanted to talk about is we want to talk about the Negro experiment. Recently, this past Sunday, Dr. Wesley Muhammad did a powerful lecture at the Nation of Islam's headquarters, Mosque Maryam, where he exposes, exposed a lot about what's going on, what's behind the vaccine, why are Black people being pushed forward when all during the Black Lives Matter March protests, we were being pushed back. So first, can you tell us a little bit about, if you can give us a beginning? I wanted to start off with this Dr. Sims. This Dr. Sims, who had a statue. His statue was in New York, I believe. And it says there was a bronze statue of Dr. named James Marion Sims. He is known as the father of modern gynecology, but achieved this title from barbaric experimental surgeries on enslaved Black women. And when I studied about what this doctor did and how he did his surgery and how he needed men to hold down these women, can you talk a little bit about this barbarism from this Dr. Sims? And if you want, even the statue that was erected for this man.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that racism is systemic, meaning that racism was not just seen in colonization and slavery and the Jim Crow era and, blatant racism that we may encounter every day, but it was embedded in systems. And so it was embedded in the perceptions of those creating the sciences and executing the sciences. And so for Dr. Sims, first of all, we have to understand that his medical training was extremely limited at that time. 3 months of training was his extent of medical school. And he, in fact, had 2 dead patients before he went on to Alabama to start the things that he's most known for. But what he was known for was this experimentation on enslaved women. And not just enslaved women, but oftentimes people don't speak about the children that he also operated on. Everything from the gynecological studies and creating a way to look inside the woman's body and using tools, and then eventually creating the speculum that's used now, doing surgical procedures without anesthesia, without consent, hysterectomies, removing body parts, right? Removing organs. Things that we actually are seeing even today at our border with the individuals who are in cages, right? No consent, hysterectomies, removal of organs, right? All of these things were happening, and he was harming women in the process. And he was not considerate of them being human because they were not looked at as human. At this time, Black people were looked at as property. And so doing something to a Black person was simply using them as a guinea pig. Even doing things to dead bodies, to Black bodies that had already been passed on, grave robbing and using cadavers and doing autopsies and all kinds of things that they were doing just to Black people.
Right.
And
he was not an outlier either. And
no,
when you say anesthesia, and not to interrupt, but when you say anesthesia, that he wasn't using anesthesia, it wasn't that he did not have anesthesia. He just didn't use anesthesia.
Correct. And there was a time where, of course, during some of his study, anesthesia may not have been available. But when the women were complaining of the pain, what his idea was one that was very common and is still common to this day in the medical field, which is that Black people do not feel pain in the same way that white people do, and that our skin is thicker, which is not at all true in any way, shape, or form. But yet this is the ideology that went behind a lot of the thought processes of why it's okay to continue, even though this person is clearly agonizing in pain. Even to the extent of his views of intelligence. He believed that Black people had inferior intelligence, as was a very common belief that was perpetuated through the sciences, through psychology, through psychiatry, through some of the different studies that were produced that suggested that we were inferior. And for him, because he believed that we were inferior, he believed that we were less intelligent, because he believed that the skulls of Black people grew too quickly around the brain. And so he would operate on children where he would use a shoemaker's tool to physically loosen the skulls of children. That was his perception of helping the Black community.
Right.
And so for him, he was the father of gynecology. He was, someone who was looked at and praised for his work. And that's why the statue was erected as, a celebration of this individual who's done all this amazing work. Without his work, we wouldn't have the things that we have today, but we don't talk about how he got there. And that's why there was a huge conversation about removing that statue or replacing it with information that tells the truth, and that whole dichotomy of what do we do with these racist individuals who have been glorified in this country.
And once again, we want to emphasize that the only reason why we're talking about him, because he's once again not an outlier. He was one among many. The only reason why we're talking about him is because he did, and the woman, her name, I believe, was where's her name at? Here's her name. Her name was Ann Archer. A Black woman named Ann Archer endured 30 procedures without anesthesia. His statue should be taken down, and her statue should be erected. And the number of other women that he operated on, their statues should be erected. So once again, we have this whitewashing of history where the beast is glorified, and the actual individuals who really contributed to the advancement of science and medicine were hidden in history. You talked about how we were talked in medical fields as less intelligent. Can you talk about this theory in the 1830s called polygenes? And it says that in the 1930s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, where so-called research was used to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there was polygenicists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolved from different origins. In the 1930s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. So once again, science and medicine was used by the system of white supremacy to dehumanize, if you will, Black people.
Absolutely. And I believe we're gonna cut to a break, but after that break, we're gonna talk about polygenesis and how that contributed to some of the things that we see in science today.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so this is Steve Muhammad with the Black Narrative, and we're going to cut to a quick announcement, and we'll be right back.
Be a part of the force that powers truth in journalism. Your support helps to combat false media. Cash App NNV News.
Greetings. This is Tarika Shakir Muhammad with National Network View. This week's Final Call cover story talks about the presidential inauguration, an American insurrection, threats to national security, and the loss of national unity. Uneasiness, fear, and division plague the United States at a critical hour. Can America survive? Will there be war at the Capitol? To read more, please subscribe to FinalCallDigital.com and tune in to Final Call Radio. This is Tarika Shakir Muhammad with an NNVnews.com final call cover story.
All right, and we're back. Thank you once again for joining us. And time flies, as they say, when you're having fun. And time flies when you're uncovering, when you're learning things, brothers and sisters. That's why the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said, one of the greatest knowledges that we can get is the knowledge of self and the knowledge of God and the knowledge of that and the knowledge of other than self, and also the knowledge of history. So one of the things that we're going to go into is the knowledge of history, because if you know what happened yesterday, then you can intelligently plan today to make your moves for tomorrow. And one of the things that we need to really consider on doing today is if we're going to take that vaccine or not. And I think that through this interview, it will help you to decide whether you want to go down that road. And so we're talking about polygenesis and how these medical so-called professionals and scientists, how they classify Black people as subhuman and other types of things, like you said, where we don't feel as much pain and where our skin is thicker and things like that. Can you go a little bit into that?
Absolutely. So with polygenesis, the whole idea here is that if we acknowledge that civilization, humanity started with creation, and that God created two individuals, and that those two individuals led up to what is historically known as the flood. And from the flood, Noah and the individuals in his family then went on to procreate, and that led us to where we are today. If we acknowledge that monogenesis theology, which is real,
right,
we not acknowledge the truth, then what we acknowledge is that we all come from the same place. We all come from the same bloodlines. We all come from the same civilization. And to acknowledge that would then mean that we are equal genetically, that DNA wise, there is no biological difference across race. And that was an idea that nobody wanted to admit to if they were going to continue enslaving and using people as property and harming and killing people and raping people and doing the egregious acts that were known in the white community during those times of slavery and colonization. And so, unfortunately, that ideology of where we came from had to change in order for it to fit the story and justify the harmful acts that were being done to people of color. And so the idea that you must have come from someone else, you must have come from something else, there's no way that we all came from the same place, even though history and science all align with even most holy books that talk about how civilization came to be and where that was located and what those people look like and how the genes came from. And now you see all of these different genetic ancestry programs where people can start to identify their genes. And there's a lot of surprise when people start to recognize that indeed we all contain genes from all around the world, particularly Africa, which is the birthplace of civilization.
Right. Absolutely. Beautiful. And I know that, what the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, he brought out one of their scientists, Mendel, and he talked about how you have the recessive gene and the dominant gene. And so Black is dominant, Black skin is dominant, brown eyes is dominant, Black hair is dominant, white skin is recessive, blue eyes are recessive, and blonde eyes are dominant. So if you marry a dominant onto a recessive, you will get the dominant, and so.
And it goes even deeper than that, right? It goes even deeper down to the very sperm cells and egg cells within the individual, because as a person who contains genes that go all the way back through your ancestry, there are the abilities for a Black woman to produce a child that looks and appears white and a child that looks and appears Black, one with red hair, one with black hair. It just depends on the genes that are within that particular cell. And I think that's the part that people didn't want to understand. They want to focus on these bigger ideas that, it's that simple that white plus white equals white. And that's just not how that works. It's not how that works at all. It comes down to the individual cells. And if, you're talking about 2 million cells that could fertilize an egg, that's 2 million chances of 23 chromosome makeups that could be implemented into that person when that cell meets the egg.
Right.
And you have different opportunities. So if the egg and the sperm have straight hair, then the child will have straight hair. But if just the egg or just the sperm has curly hair, that baby gonna have curly hair. And that's what we mean by dominant versus recessive, meaning it takes two if it's recessive, it only takes one if it's dominant. And when we look at those genes and you see that those traits typically are what we see in Black people, that was like, wait a minute. You're saying that we're mutated. You're saying that, there's a mutation of the gene, because recessive genes also could be applied to things like dwarfed limbs or extra fingers or extra toes. And that sounds negative to people. So they're like, oh, wait a minute. We want to be superior. We don't want to be the inferior side.
Absolutely. And so that brings us right on up to, this miscegenation, right? Or race mixing. And it says that, and so coming up into a little bit of time in the 1830s, it says after the Civil War ended in the 1900s, brought a wave of immigrants to the U.S. that sparked panic among whites and included with the and coincided, with the birth of the American eugenics movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project. An excellent documentary to watch would be the one on MyAlpha 21. But can you go into this forced sterilization and then the methods that were used to trick Black women into birth control?
Absolutely. I mean, we see it very, very clearly. Margaret Sanger said it very explicitly that her intent behind Planned Parenthood was to basically sneak into the Black communities and start doing eugenics without anyone knowing what was happening. She based her model off of Adolf Hitler and looking at what happened with the Jewish Holocaust and how we can create this idea that there can be a superior race. And so we want to start to eliminate the undesirables until we can continue to procreate until this superior race is fully crafted and exists. And so it was very easy to do that. And these things all coincide together. See, I think we like to try to separate them out and talk about things separately. Like, let's talk about health, and let's talk about poverty, and then let's talk about racism. But they all go together hand in hand. So when we look at racism, which when we talk about racism, we mean prejudice towards people of color, plus the power of having a system that has benefited from slavery and racism. Right now, we're looking at that being implemented in many different areas. So when we look at the Constitution, for example, and we start looking at all of the amendments, and we start looking at things like sharecropping after slavery and how that impacted the Black community and their ability to create a leg to stand on and create wealth for themselves or create sustainability. And they couldn't, because sharecropping means we're going to borrow everything and then we have to pay back more than what we borrowed to start with. And we're always in the hole. We always owe you. And then, of course, we could go on and on with other things that happen, from redlining and restrictive covenants to keep people from being able to live in desirable neighborhoods, and then placing certain things in those neighborhoods. Well, one of those things that was placed in the Black neighborhood, along with liquor stores, was Planned Parenthood. We're going to put that in the neighborhood, but real health care, access to real health care, we're not going to put that there. So if we put a Planned Parenthood in a Black neighborhood and then we label it as health care, family planning, the Planned Parenthood was for abortion of Black children. That was what it was strategically placed for. but we call it family planning. When in reality, it's about people who didn't have a plan. If you had a plan, you probably wouldn't have ended up there considering these options to start with, right? So this whole idea of changing the verbiage, changing the narrative, trying to act like we're making it so that you have control, when in reality, you're not doing things out of your control. You're doing things the way that we're telling you to do things. Because along with those restrictive covenants, we're also going to say, oh, well, we don't have job opportunities for the men here. You have to outsource for your jobs. Oh, and by the way, the government will take care of the women as long as the men aren't in the house. So now you have a woman who's trying to maintain, and she's in the house maybe with government assistance, and they're telling her you can't have a man in the house. Well, if you don't have a two-parent household, or you don't have the stability of two parents, are you really necessarily wanting the financial expenses of a child, the physical toll, and all these other things? So it's a manipulation piece. We're going to trick you into not being two-parent households and saying that it's because of the money you have to do it this way. And then we're going to trick you into thinking you can't sustain taking care of children. And so we're going to also use other things like racism and how employment works and all of that. And we're creating this racial wealth gap that causes people to say, I can't handle this situation. And now Planned Parenthood is this pretty little way out, right? This pretty little way that is sounding like we're here to help you and support you in this time of you dealing with this difficult decision. But in reality, they're saying we just want to get rid of the Black babies as much as we can.
And just to bring on that point, and we're going to take another break, and see, when we talk about the Negro experiment, we're not only talking about the methods that were used against the person's will, but we're also talking about the manipulative tactics that were used also to create conditions to get us into, as you say, aborting our children, or these manipulative moves to get us to take these vaccinations. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. This is Steve Muhammad with the Black Narrative on National Network View, and we'll be right back.
National Network View was recently banned from the media platform YouTube.com. Within 12 hours, the NNV IT department quickly sprung into action with an independent service system to back NNVnews.com. The nation's news network is now streaming content 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. As we extend gratitude for the believers' financial support through donations, this media activism will not stop. Please continue to be a part of a force that powers truth in journalism. Your support helps to combat false media. Donate to NNV News. This is Clifton Muhammad with National Network View.
And we're back with the Black Narrative on National Network View. And we're here with Professor Curtis Taylor, MA. We got to put some respect on your name. Tell us what that MA stands for, and tell us a little bit more about how we can contact you to get more of this information.
Yes, well, the MA stands for Masters of Arts in Psychology with a concentration in international psychology. That's my focus area, and I teach at Sinclair Community College Black psychology, as well as general psychology and social psychology. And I'm also the director of African American Studies at Sinclair. So you can contact me at taylor.curtis@sinclair.edu if you have questions about learning more about the Black experience, not just the Black experience, but the systems and narratives that we've experienced as well. And I delve into empowerment, because not only do we need to have the knowledge of self and have the knowledge of where we've come from to understand how we can use that information to move forward, but we also have to delve into how to care for ourselves in the midst of all of this. And so if you check out my website, I have a self-care business. I do empowerment through self-care. And that is something that I'm very passionate about, as we need to navigate these experiences on a regular basis, not only in our mental and physical health, but our emotional, psychological, and spiritual health as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's go and come up a little bit more. We're going through time here, and so now we're in the 1930s. That more than half of the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In the 1960s, 1961, civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed. But was subject to a hysterectomy. And if you can explain what that means to us, without her consent, which rendered her infertile. The procedure was common in the South, and Hamer said or dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy. Can you tell us what that procedure, that hysterectomy, what they did to our sister?
Absolutely. So a hysterectomy is when a doctor goes in and literally removes all of the reproductive organs. So a full hysterectomy is removing all of the reproductive organs of the woman's body. And so that's why it renders her infertile, because she literally has no capacity to create or hold life within her body anymore after that. And a lot of times it was done, again, in a surgical procedure, cutting someone open, removing organs, no anesthetics, not being considered about caring for the wounds, the areas. A lot of times that scar tissue, especially in those areas, develops from a lot of incisions and things like that. And it became known as the Mississippi appendectomy because appendicitis was a very common thing. Your appendix is all of a sudden haywire and we just take it out.
Right.
That's just something that we're used to hearing about. Why do you need an appendix? We take them out anyway, right? That's what it became the norm. And so was sterilizing women in this way. And so if you came in for an issue that could have been resolved, they would still remove your female organs to prevent you from being able to reproduce. And again, that goes back to my story at the beginning, because what we're seeing now is some of the same thing, different tactics. So instead of saying, oh, we just forced the hysterectomy on you, what we're seeing is, oh, the doctor never caught this, and now it's too far gone. And now that we're here to do a surgery for maybe some other reason, for example, a family member of mine had a tumor, a fibroid tumor. So it's near her reproductive areas, right? So fibroid tumor, it grows. Now we need to have surgery. She was just supposed to remove the tumor. But because some of the other issues like mine that she had that went undetected for so long, it had caused so much damage that they had to remove all of the rest of it. So it's the same story. It's just packaged a little bit differently now, but it all goes back to underlying bias and racism, where people are not listening to the people of color or not caring about what people of color want or need or have going on for their health and their safety.
And, you know, Harriet Washington, she wrote a medical apartheid. I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Vernelia Randall, who once lived here in Dayton. She wrote a book, Dying While Black. And one of the things that she spoke about, of course, was, as you're saying, we go into these hospitals as Black people. And I want to mention, too, that many of these doctors that we're talking about, they were never prosecuted. Many of these doctors who did these forced sterilizations and did these experiments, and when we go further on into this interview, we'll see how these doctors experimented on prisoners and things like that. In Nazi Germany, these doctors were under Operation Paperclip, were brought into America, and many of them were given high positions in hospitals. So these hospitals are, what do they say when you're in a crime? They're yeah, they're also a part of this whole thing. So don't think that just because you go into this so-called established institution that it's looking out for your best interests.
Absolutely.
So
we could even look at the emergency room doctor last year who was a
That's right.
member of the Ohio Senate who said colored people is the term, the derogatory term he used, and said that we must not wash our hands, and that must be the reason why we see more coronavirus in the Black and brown community. It's still the mentality. That's an emergency room doctor. He immediately lost his job as an emergency room doctor, thank goodness. Right. But had racism not been declared a public health crisis only a few minutes before that, would he have still lost his job? Had Black Lives Matter not been a cry that was happening globally across 114 countries, would he have still lost his job? Probably not. I've been to the emergency room and been declined service or declined what I need, which, by the way, if that ever happens to you, make sure you ask them to note it in their notes that they declined the treatment that you asked for.
Absolutely. And so let's go on into in June, and we're going to get into some other incidents. Right now, we're just talking about individuals who are basically free, but we're going to talk about what many people don't know, and that is what you talked about, the morphing of the slave system from sharecropping to chain gangs to now the prison industrial complex, and how we'll get right into that in a few seconds. But it says in June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100,000 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds. In Alabama, half of those women were Black. So, you know, when they asked the question about Black people and our hesitancy in getting this vaccine, Operation Warp Speed, as they call it, then once again, here we have more than ample evidence of why we should not take their vaccine. Listen to this. It says, and you'll probably remember this, in December of 1990, this is going on. The FDA approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marked to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools. Can you talk a little bit about that Norplant? Because I know that the Nation of Islam, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, the torchlight for Black America, warned Black women not to get that Norplant, and it found out that Norplant was a agent, if you will, that sterilized Black women.
Absolutely. There are tons of different forms of birth control, and a lot of them are now used as an implant. And there are a lot of issues with a lot of these drugs that have not really been looked at. I mean, when we talk about putting something into your body that's going to be constantly releasing chemicals, you have to think, what in the world is happening? Is it natural? And how does that impact the natural homeostasis of my body? And a lot of times, because it's commercialized and because it's offered and because it's promoted by doctors, we don't question the nature of the medications that we're using, when in fact, a lot of the medications later on come up for recall and come up to show issues, and later on causing it to be no longer available in the United States, or no longer something we can use because here's all of the problems that it caused years down the line. And I think it's very intentional. There was a conversation I remember as a child having with my doctor. Why is it that people are asking to take a human papillomavirus vaccine for just Black girls? I mean, the commercial had Black girls double Dutch singing the song about the vaccine, and it had Black parents saying, whatever this is, this must be for my daughter. And the doctor said, this is about cells that are altered because of sexual interaction and unhealthy sexual interactions that could influence this virus, and that could lead to cancer. And so we want to prevent that. But first, does that even apply to your child? You know, and that was the conversation my doctor had, even when I was a child. And my doctor said, don't just take the vaccine just because it's there. that doesn't mean that that's for you. And we have to really analyze what's in these things. And so for this, birth control was promoted heavily. It was promoted in many different ways. My first experiences of hearing about birth control were not about birth control for the purpose of sexual encounters. The birth control was, oh, if you have a lot of cramps, you should get on birth control.
Right.
That was the conversation.
Yes.
My parents were like, absolutely not. But that was the conversation. And so this idea that, oh, this will help you, this will protect you, this will help you with your experiences on a regular basis, not knowing that some of the foods that we've been exposed to and the foods that we've eaten because of food accessibility or lack thereof, or education about food or lack thereof, those things can contribute to some of the issues that you're experiencing. Rather than you going to get some medication, you can just change your diet. But of course, that's not the conversation they want to have, because there was very strong intent behind what this is going to do and why we're going to use it. And again, I challenge people to ask, how does this truly impact my health? Because a lot of young ladies who were on that implant, they weren't having nature. Nature wasn't happening.
Right.
We should question anything that changes our biological nature.
That's absolutely right. I mean, that's, once again, sister, I really appreciate you coming on to this program, because I mean, this is a serious conversation, and something that, those who are thinking about getting this vaccine should really consider. One of the things too, there are 3 ways, for us to get a disease into the body, to digest it, to drink it, to absorb it. And then there's that 4th way is to be injected with it. One of the things that you talked about, or you didn't mention, but is that HPV, that they try to push, talking about, as you were saying, manipulating people, scare tactics to get this HPV, to prevent their daughters, and now even young boys, to get the HPV shot. So it's absolutely ridiculous. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I just think one of the biggest areas that people look to is the Tuskegee experiment, which I think people don't know the true history behind that. But what transpired first took place in Guatemala. In Guatemala, the U.S. government ran experiments on prisoners, soldiers, women and men, and they injected people with syphilis purposely. And from there, after that horrible experiment, then they came, and one of the same scientists came to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where the men already had syphilis, but we're going to give them fake medical care because we really just want to watch them die, so that we can talk about the progression of syphilis until death and have that research. And so I think that's the main thing that's in folks' minds as they think about, should I take this first? Should I be in the first group of people to just adapt to this medication as quickly as it's been created, especially with it being pushed seemingly towards the Black community?
Absolutely. Well, we're up against the hour. We wanted to get into, and we'll have to bring you back for sure, because I would love to talk about the experiments that were, forced on prisoners, and them being told that they were giving their consent. But how do you give your consent when you're behind the prison walls? And then the experiment on children. In the 90s, the New York State Psychiatric Institute conducted a study into genetic roots of violence, and paid mothers $120 to inject their young children, young boys, with an agent that they still don't know what caused that. And then Henrietta Lacks. So closing out, any parting words for us as we close out this interview? And once again, we'll have to have you back to go deeper into those subjects there.
Absolutely. Closing out, as an educator, my job is to educate, not to give my opinion, but to give facts. And so what I say is, seek the knowledge, do the research, do the extensive research. Forget what Facebook told you, forget what social media said, forget what your friends said, but do the research for yourself and take the time to look at the full picture, not just the individual part. Because when we look at the big picture, we can understand that racism is a big problem that is impacting every area of our lives. And we have to be strategic and knowledgeable before we can move forward if we want to see our society change for the better.
All right. That's Professor Taylor Curtis, and we want to thank you. And once again, we're going to say, definitely some prayers for our sister, that she not only has a successful surgery, but a speedy recovery. And brothers and sisters, once again, I would urge you to go to NOI.org and watch the Part 1 and Part 2 lectures by Dr. Wesley. And of course, watch the July the 4th lecture by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, The Criterion. Don't take that vaccine. All right. So with that, I want to leave you in peace. I want to ask you to follow us on social media, like our YouTube page, and subscribe, and go to our website, National Network View, nnvnews.com. This is Steve Muhammad with the Black Narrative. Take care.
Be a part of the force that powers truth in journalism. Your support helps to combat false media. Cash App, NNV News.
The nation must acquire land. Production of food, clothing, and shelter. Freedom is independent agriculture. Farming is the engine of the nation.